Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to break down a 400-year-old masterpiece, but definitely not as some dusty ancient text. We're looking at it as the gripping, fast-paced psychological thriller it truly is. We are unpacking William Shakespeare's The Tragedy of Macbeth. If you think you know this story just from vague high school memories, well, prepare to see it in a completely new light. We're going to look at the blood, the betrayal, and the absolutely brilliant psychological mapping of a mind descending into total madness.
Okay, let's dive into this. Right at the very beginning of a play, the Weird Sisters, these three ambiguous supernatural witches, utter these exact 8 words. Fair is foul, foul is fair. I mean, what a way to open a story, right? These 8 paradoxical words effectively set off one of the bloodiest narratives in all of English literature. They establish a world where literally nothing is as it seems, where morality is flipped completely upside down, and where good and evil just blur together to create the ultimate trap for our main character.
Here's our game plan for today. We'll start with a bloody rise to power, then profile the key players, before diving into the psychology of guilt. After that, we'll weigh fate versus free will, and finally, unpack the major themes. Let's get right to it. Kicking things off with Section 1, A Bloody Rise to Power and the Descent into Tyranny. Hold on tight, because this plot moves with the pacing of a true crime podcast. Just look at how fast things spiral completely out of control here. We kick off with the prophecy. Macbeth, who is this brave, successful Scottish general, meets the witches who tell him he's gonna be king. And when part of their prophecy actually comes true, ambition just takes over. This leads directly to regicide. Macbeth and his wife, Lady Macbeth, murder the gentle, trusting King Duncan to seize the throne. But as we know, one murder is never enough, is it? To keep his grip on power, Macbeth descends into absolute paranoia. He has his fellow general Banquo murdered because the witches prophesied Banquo's heirs would take the crown. Then comes the massacre, where a completely unhinged Macbeth slaughters the innocent family of his rival Macduff. And finally, we hit vengeance. Macduff kills Macbeth in battle, and Duncan's son Malcolm is restored to the throne. It is this incredibly rapid, brutal timeline showing how one single murder to grab power spirals into an absolute bloodbath. Which brings us to Section 2, the play's key players. To really grasp these murders, we have to understand the minds behind them. To figure out Macbeth himself, we need to talk about hamartia. It's this concept from Aristotle that outlines a fatal flaw leading to the downfall of a tragic hero. And Macbeth? He is the classic Aristotelian tragic hero. You see, he doesn't start out as a monster. He actually begins the play as a remarkably brave soldier, highly respected, fiercely loyal. But that persona is entirely corrupted by his specific fatal flaw, which is his unchecked ambition. It's this ambition that totally overrides his initial moral compass and turns him into a paranoid tyrant. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the incredible character chiasmus at play here. Basically, it's a literary crossing of paths. You have Macbeth, who starts out incredibly morally conflicted about killing the king, right? But he eventually hardens into this tyrannical, paranoid monster who kills without a second thought. And then, on the flip side, you have Lady Macbeth. She starts the play completely resolute, utterly ruthless, ready to do whatever it takes. Yet by the end of the narrative, she's the one who completely breaks, ultimately consumed by guilt and madness. As he becomes totally numb, she becomes overwhelmed. Their psychological trajectories cross paths perfectly right in the middle of the play. Lady Macbeth's initial ruthlessness is terrifyingly captured in her famous invocation to the dark forces, to be unsexed. She's actively manipulating her husband, basically telling him his human kindness is a massive weakness. She literally begs the spirits to strip away her femininity, her capacity for maternal care, and her human empathy so she can be completely filled with the direst cruelty. She is asking to be entirely devoid of all human compassion, just to be ruthless enough to commit murder. It's chilling. And just to quickly round out the world around our main duo, let's look at the players caught in the crossfire. You have Duncan, the gentle, trusting king whose tragic murder kicks off all this chaos. Then there's Banquo, a
A fellow general, he's morally upright, totally suspicious of Macbeth, and it's his brutal murder that leads to his ghost haunting Macbeth later on. Macduff, the Thane of Fife, becomes the ultimate loyal opponent seeking vengeance after his family is slaughtered. And finally, Malcolm, Duncan's rightful heir, who really carefully and intelligently tests Macduff's loyalty before leading that final rebellion. The fallout from all these actions leads us right into Section 3, the psychology of guilt and a descent into madness. This is where things get really mysterious. So, how does guilt actually physically and psychologically manifest when you've done the unthinkable? Well, Shakespeare shows us in 3 incredibly vivid ways. First, through terrifying hallucinations, like that bloody dagger Macbeth sees floating in the air before he even commits the murder. Second, through sleepwalking. Lady Macbeth is so consumed by repressed guilt that she sleepwalks, desperately trying to wash invisible blood from her hands before she dies, which is likely by suicide. And third, the physical manifestation of paranoia, Banquo's ghost. Macbeth's guilt literally conjures the bloody ghost of his murdered friend right in the middle of a crowded royal banquet. Talk about an awkward dinner party. And this brilliant imagery shows us something crucial. The internal guilt and tyranny of the characters are reflected in the external world itself. The language Shakespeare uses is just heavy and oppressive. Blood is absolutely everywhere, not just as physical evidence, but as this inescapable stain on the soul. The constant interplay of darkness and light underscores the evil deeds happening under the cover of night. And perhaps most interestingly, there is massive disorder in nature. Horses eat each other, owls kill falcons, the earth literally shakes. The violent disruption of the political order creates this unnatural chaos in the physical world around them. All of this unnatural chaos leads directly to the core philosophical question of Section 4, fate versus free will. Who is really in control? I want to pose this question directly to you, just as the play poses it to its audience. Is Macbeth a victim of fate, manipulated by these supernatural forces? Or is he a victim of his own free will and ambition? Did the witches actually cause the tragedy? Or were they just catalysts? It's such a fascinating debate. They tell him he will be king, sure, but they never once tell him to murder someone to get there. Macbeth takes that horrifying step entirely on his own. Adding another layer to this supernatural manipulation is Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, who shows up to oversee the 3 witches. But I want to toss in a really surprising literary fact here. Many scholars actively dispute the authorship of Hecate's scenes. Because her dialogue style is slightly different, it's widely believed that her scenes might have actually been a later addition by another playwright, like Thomas Middleton, just to add more spectacle and musical numbers for the crowd. But within the story itself, her presence really underscores the sheer weight of dark magic closing in on our tragic hero. Now, the witches are absolute masters of manipulating fate through these ambiguous riddles. They tell an overconfident Macbeth that no man of woman born can harm him. Macbeth takes this literally, thinking, great, I'm completely invincible. Everyone is born of a woman. But the riddle is shockingly fulfilled at the very end when Macduff reveals he was from his mother's womb untimely ripped, meaning he was delivered via a cesarean section. The witches told the truth, but they twisted it just enough to lead Macbeth into a totally false sense of security. All right, let's pull all these threads together in Section 5, unpacking the major themes, looking at gender, power, and real-world politics. So, the crucial point is how all these elements weave together into these major themes. We've got the deeply corrupting nature of unchecked ambition, seeing how the hunger for power destroys not just the victim, but the perpetrator themselves. We also see this terrifying theme where masculinity is tied inextricably to violence. Characters constantly question each other's manhood to provoke violence, painting a society where being a real man basically means being a ruthless killer. And it all centers around Macbeth as the quintessential Shakespearean tragic hero, a truly great man brought to absolute ruin by his own devastating choices. And, of course, we can't ignore the historical context. Shakespeare definitely didn't write this in a vacuum. When we compare the events of the play to Jacobean reality, some fascinating parallels pop up. In the play, Banquo is portrayed as this highly morally upright hero who resists temptation. Why? Well, because the play was written shortly after King James I took the throne, and King James claimed to be a direct descendant of the historical Banquo. Plus, that heavy focus on witches? Not random at all. King James I was deeply paranoid about witches, and even wrote a whole book on witchcraft called Demonology. Shakespeare clearly and masterfully tailored the play's politics and supernatural elements to captivate and, let's be honest, flatter his new king. To wrap things up, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Would Macbeth have murdered the king if the witches had never planted the idea in the first place? It really forces us to ponder the terrifying power of suggestion. If someone tells you that you are destined for absolute greatness, how far would you go to make it happen? It's a profound question about the true nature of human ambition, and honestly, it's just as relevant today as it was 400 years ago. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and